Welcome everyone to this extraordinary session with the title Get to 360, Differentiate Your Communication by Scaling in Digital Era. Really glad to welcome four amazing speakers. And first of all, I would like to introduce Aymani Dunbar from LinkedIn. Hi Aymani, how are you?
Doing well, Dario. Thank you. How are you?
Thank you. Christian Pavlo from Sando. Hi Christian, how are you?
Hi Dario, I'm doing very well, thank you.
Ariel from Forrester. Hi Ariel, how are you? Ariel?
Unmute.
Doing well, thank you. How about now?
Great.
There we go.
Corey from Omnipresence, same question for you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Nice to see everyone here and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So first of all, let's focus to one keyword, which is obviously differentiate. A very frequent management term, but who has mastered it or who dares to differentiate in significant meaning, right? Because companies who did disrupted their industry and these days are studied in different business cases and books. Nowadays, when all efforts and conversations are channeled to digital, it's more than ever important to differentiate. And one crucial and authentic segment how to achieve that is for sure customer experience. It can't be copied, and it's really important to be very authentic and original. When I thought about experience, I believe it's definitely culture driven, since if you speak purely about strategy, then we all know that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And a very unique example of that is, for instance, Sir Richard Branson, who owns many different businesses, but each of those businesses differentiates itself by delivering extraordinary customer experience. So, for instance, the aviation industry is not well known for a good and proper experience, while Virgin, of course, is I would say benchmark in the industry by providing amazing experience. Plus, one very interesting quote, would definitely like to quote Rory Sutherland, who said that for a business to be truly customer focused, it needs to ignore what people say, and instead it needs to concentrate what people feel. For instance, an interesting case study to illustrate that is for sure Uber. When you actually open the app, it shows you a real-time map of nearby drivers, but most importantly, you see how long it will take before your driver gets you from your initial request. This near future does not reduce the waiting time for an Uber driver, but it makes waiting 90% less frustrating. And that's proper experience. And this is what we will speak about today. So really glad to welcome this amazing panel group. And first of all, I would like to start with asking a question to Christian, which is we all know that pharma companies were forced to move for digital channels, right? And why did we have such delay compared with other industries who mastered it much earlier? And how can they continue to make more progress in the future?
Hey, thanks Dario for the question. It's a very interesting question, a very important question for pharma companies, because I think your starting point is absolutely right. We have a lot of experience in pharma with a lot of different channels. However, digital channels have never been on top of the mix. And now we got forced into a new normal with that. So I come back to the why question in a second, but yeah, just to illustrate how we've been forced into the new normal. We looked at our customer interactions in Eastern Europe and looked across countries in how was the access through digital channels before the COVID crisis started and now. Before that, we think that on average, we had like 15% of our customers to which we had access through digital channels. Customers here are healthcare providers, usually physicians, and that jumped basically overnight to about 2/3 of the customers who we're now approaching over digital channels. Now, that is great, that digital channels are part of the mix. Let's see what happens as things revert back to normal. But back to your why question. I think a couple of reasons. I mean, one reason is implied in the question. You talked about customer experience. I was just talking about customers, but that's actually unusual terminology. Traditionally, as an industry, we are very sensitive talking about customers. We have stakeholders, we have prescribers. So we never focused very much that there might be a customer out there who needs to have an experience. And that's the first thing that got into our way. If I phrase it a slightly provocative way, we thought that we are, as an industry, are something very different, maybe something better than the industries that have laid out the path to digital experience. But the good news is we are in a position now to learn and to adapt very quickly, and in a way we are forced into the new normal.
Thank you, Christian. Let's move forward to Corey, who recently with Omnipresence and Reuters did a very interesting survey and report afterwards. So Corey, could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think the survey information that we got was very enlightening, and this is available to anyone who wants to grab it now or after the event. But this survey went to almost 1,500 people, and this was a couple months into the real start of the work from home situation around the pandemic. And we got a lot of strong opinions and feedback on things. So when we look at, what Christian was saying about the capabilities to deliver these digital experiences, you can see at the top, right, 1/3 of people saying they don't have the right tools for that full digital access. And if you put that with 2/3 of your customers who want to have this, then you've got a lot of people who are not getting the right information at the right time. So for an organization here who doesn't have the right tools, there's a lot at stake, because this is the perfect time for a competitor to sweep in and pick up those people. We can look at some of the other stats here, right? Where people are saying their platform doesn't support this. Half of the people saying their platform doesn't support those kinds of interactions that are required now. So, not only is there big impact on the customers, but that impact and stress is going to come back to the team on how do we react to this and meet with our customers the way they need to do it. We're going to be falling short of their expectations so often. And so maybe not surprising, but what we see is that 1/3 of the respondents, again, so almost 1,500 people, 1/3 saying that they are looking to change their platform or augment the tools that they have to drive better service and interactions with their customers.
Thank you, Corey. Let's speak about a very important topic, which is definitely push-pull communication. And it became very challenging since field force is considered as a typical push channel. Christian, how can new digital tools or channels get us closer to our customers or stakeholders, if you would like so?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, a basic barrier has come down, and this is the basic barrier about how people in their life, including their private life, are dealing with digital channels. I mean, during lockdowns all over the world, also our stakeholders, our customers have learned that they're talking to their families, to their relatives, to their parents, and so via Skype, Zoom, and all other platforms. And I think that's made it easier for them to also integrate these things in their professional life. But one important thing with respect to your question, Dario, is also, I think this is a moment to hold us more honest around our customer communications. So as I said before, and as we saw also from the survey that Corey shared, it is in a way harder to get a hold of our customers in pharma and life sciences via digital channels. I would dare the statement that this doesn't mean to imply that these channels are somehow worse or inferior or so to our classical channels. It is just harder to hide the typical difficulties to get hold of a customer. If you send a rep to the office or to the clinic or so, you know what happens. I mean, in many cases, and so there will not be quality time spent. In some cases, you make it to the doctor, there will be a courtesy call or so. But we know that the stickiness of messages and the success of such a call, in many cases, can be doubted. So with the incoming barrier being a bit higher on digital, probably we are in a position, and as digital managers in companies, we are in a position to challenge, those who are in charge of the classical channels, and reverse a bit the burden of proof. So often we are challenged on digital and say, like, prove that it's effective. I think we can turn it around now and say, well, the basic barrier has come down. So prove back how effective you are with the classical methods that are out there.
Thank you, Christian. Let's move forward to speak about digital channels with a digital expert coming from a digital or social media company, which is, of course, LinkedIn, and in that case, Imani. Imani, how do you see this move from push to pull marketing from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Dario, and good morning and good afternoon to all who've joined. Coming from someone who's not in pharma and hasn't spent, their career in pharma, I've spent most of my career in tech and in consulting. I think there's always the consideration, even before I start talking about the pull, of, what's the balance between the push and pull. And when I at least think about some of the things that have happened historically and where we've progressed, I think there's plenty of options from a push-pull perspective. When I look at the pharma industry, there's a lot of different levers that can be pulled, but I think it's important to factor in a couple of different things, not just the push-pull technology and the perspective, but also understanding where you are in your member or customer journey lifecycle. So as an example, if you think about a four-way matrix, and on one axis you have push-pull communications, and on another axis you have overall maturity. If you're dealing with someone who is a new member, who is maybe looking to engage a healthcare provider for services, and you're thinking about a push, maybe your best method is just purely information, right? But let's dial that in a bit more, and then let's think about, are you providing that information depending on where your customer is? As an example, I'm here in California, so there's a push information that can come out regardless of who I am related to the pandemic. But there could also be a push component of it that's maybe related to air quality and lung safety, because we're in the midst of having wildfire season, right? So how are we also thinking about the push-pull mechanism depending on where the customer is in that journey, but also depending on where they sit, right? So how can you actually dial it in? And that personalization of information is something that can be done very effectively now, given where we are. Another quick example, if I kind of move to the pull horizon, and I'm thinking about someone who, again, is maybe not yet a member or a customer, but is looking to engage. If I'm going to an information source, and maybe I'm looking to get information, a bit more information, to pull that information as it relates to the pandemic or as it relates to a wildfire situation, how are you then leveraging some of those data sources to help guide that pool and help inform that pool? So maybe if I come in and I've done a history of clicks or a cookie history of tracking in terms of searches, how am I incorporating, or how can you be incorporating that information into the push-pull component? The very last thing that I'll maybe kind of talk about at a really high level, and I know there'll be a question segment here shortly, Dario, is if I'm dealing with someone who's already a client and I'm looking to push them information, maybe as opposed to it being more genericized, how am I factoring in their overall history in terms of what their historical health has been, right? So maybe I'm now instead pushing information related to updates and new testing related to things that may have been part of their medical history. If they've got history in asthma, maybe I'm now pushing information to them that's more tailored from that component. So I think thinking about the notion of push versus pull, but also thinking about where your patient or where your customer is on their overall journey and horizon, and then trying to tailor that and make it personalized as much as possible while incorporating a collection of information, I think will be very powerful. The last thing I'll quickly say is, if you look at, I think LinkedIn published maybe earlier this month or later in August, kind of the top 10 growing companies, and two of them, not surprisingly, are messaging companies. One is video messaging and one is kind of traditional messaging. So the time is kind of now to try and evangelize the opportunity that's before not just this industry, but before all industries as it relates to leveraging social media and the power that can be harnessed.
Thank you, Imani. Corey, what's your view on that coming from a solution vendor side who is delivering exceptional customer experience? So how do you see this move from push to pull?
Yeah, no, I think what Imani's talking about is really important to consider. For me, part of the idea moving from push to pull is looking at that overall customer experience, right? In my background as a person who builds products and software and stuff, traditionally I always thought about what's the user experience, right? So how are they experiencing what I produce? And so we're very, I think most humans in that producing and then pushing out what we do. But what we've seen over the years is this transformation of how people pick up software and pick up services. It's much more driven by the consumer, the customer. So we are moving into a pull sort of situation. It used to be I had to have people to go out and sell my product. Now it's easy. I can swipe a credit card or punch in my PayPal information onto a website and get what I want when I want it without having to talk to people. So this idea of switching from being always push to having a lot of pull channels. Think about how busy the HCPs are when you try and connect with them, and how hard it is to get their time. If you can turn this around into a pull where you've got channels that allow the HCP to initiate the interaction with you, whether that's a meeting or an email request or whatever, you're going to service their needs a lot better. And the importance of this when we come to the big picture of customer experience, when I think about user experience, it was really my silo, right? I'm building this product. I had a situation years ago. It was one of these light bulb moments. My management said, you tell me you've got this great product, but why am I getting complaints from the sales team? Why is the marketing team complaining? Why is the support team complaining? Why are we hearing these customer complaints? And I was so focused on my piece, my silo, I had to move from this piece of user experience to a broader perspective of customer experience, thinking about what's the end-to-end experience across not just what I'm doing, but how I work with all of my teammates, right? So we all have to work together. We all have to be on the same page with what's happening with the customer, and thinking about this this new world that we're in that is subscription based, right? It's not that old world where I would pay for a product and then I'm stuck with it forever. Maybe I'm hopeful that someone will upgrade. Now, monthly subscriptions, people can drop off at any point. So it might not be that my product is bad. It might be that the salesperson came in and did something that they didn't like, or when they were talking with customer support, it was too hard to get the information they needed, and so then they dropped out. So we're really in this thing where we're moving from user experience to customer experience. We've got to think about also products to brands or companies, right? How does each individual represent that bigger picture, not just their department?
Thank you, Corey. Imani, let's move back to you, and could you kindly explain to us the main difference between static and dynamic communication, which of course in pharma is still under investigation these days, but coming from LinkedIn and having different insights, could you maybe explain to our audience the main differences of static towards dynamic?
Yeah, thanks, Dario. So the most simplistic information, and you can even link this to some of the push-pull components, is from a static comms perspective, this is me as a patient or me as a healthcare provider just searching for a piece of information or a comm, and it's there, right? A white paper, something I've gone to, and it's just this source of information that lives there in a certain repository over a period of time. The dynamic communication, that's where it gets much more exciting and engaging, and that's where it becomes much more interactive, right? So that becomes, and that can start with a static piece, right? But maybe all of a sudden there's a link in that static document or that static article that I can then transfer and get a different data point for. Maybe then from there, I can actually engage in commentary and interactive dialogue with other people who have also read this particular data piece. So this dynamic portion, I think, is really where a lot of the power and the magic can happen, which is where the information is there, but it can then, in that same experience, either mature, develop, spin off into another data point. And then I think where it becomes really powerful is where you can then interact with that. Spending a little time, if I can, Dario, on like the dynamic and the interaction piece. And this is the true backbone of social media, right? Is a platform or a space where you can then engage. And that's where you can surface additional information, additional questions. And by engaging in that dialogue, I think there's two things. One, as a participant in that dialogue, it's constant digesting and processing of information. It's also sharing ideas. It's also starting to build different layers of trust, right? When you think about this profession is steeped in trust, right? So like when you're starting to have these engagements and you're starting to have that dialogue and you're either starting to have an additional viewpoint or learn, you're starting to build that trust. And recall that engagement can be with other patients, other members, can also be with healthcare professionals. So all of a sudden, if I'm in that space as a participant and I'm building that trust and I'm seeing the results I need to see, that can become very powerful. So that's one component, right? Someone who's actually an engager. The second part of that dynamic interaction is if you're someone who can then be a consumer. So maybe you're not a participant, but you can then look at that dialogue and you can look at that content and start to glean insights and start to make assumptions in terms of what are top of mind for people, what are the main concerns, what are areas where people want more information for. And if it's at the utopic level, there can be discoveries around certain patterns. So as an example, classic social media company, let's take Facebook. If you think about Facebook pages or certain Facebook posts, they have groups, right? They have groups for certain types of diseases, certain types of illnesses that can be very rare in nature. So being not necessarily a participant, but being someone who can then be an observer or a consumer of that information can be very powerful when you're thinking about things like clinical trials, when you're thinking about things of creating different solutions and medical decisions that can be very specific to certain types of people or things that are rare, or even things that might be growing or trending that are not necessarily a problem, but can then grow into an issue. So that idea of that dynamic interactive communication, I think, has extreme benefits on both someone who's an engager and then both someone who can just be a consumer of that overall engagement and interaction. Maybe the last thing that I'll put in here is another thing that's very unique and powerful about the medical professional is maybe this innate altruism, right? Which is this ability to care and truly genuinely care for the well-being of others. Assuming that everyone on this call has access to care and has the ability to get access to care, there's also an entire population of people who don't readily have access to care. There's also that population of people, when they think about the internet and engaging with the outside world, for some of them, that's entirely through a social media platform, right? Where you literally have places that are more remote, where they think about the internet and it's really a social media application. And so finding ways to like tap into social media also means exposure for populations of people who normally haven't had access to healthcare, which I think, again, taps into the innate altruism of this overall business model and space that the pharma and biomedical professionals are in.
Thank you, Imani. I also encourage our audience to ask questions if, of course, anyone wants to learn a little bit more or has a specific concrete question to our speaker group. Let's move forward to Ariel and discuss the changing expectations of patients. So Ariel comes from Forrester, so I'm pretty sure you're having some very interesting insights.
Yes, and a lot of interesting conversations with our clients and with the market. Certainly is the world looks a little bit different than it did 8-9 months ago. So I want to come back to a couple of points that Imani and Christian and Corey and Dario that you made at the beginning of this call, where we think about the customer and we keep using this word customer. And so I've heard Christian talk more about the HCP, and then we're also talking about the patient. And I think it's important for us to level set on that definition of customer, right, and who they are. And when we think about the pharmaceutical industry, we've seen this huge shift towards redefining who the customer is, right? Historically, we've thought about it as the HCP, and that's who we have to get to in the office and make sure that they're an advocate in pushing whatever product we have. But the patient is so much more empowered now, right? As we think about access to internet, to social media, right? As you were saying, it's changed the conversation. And so when you think about, this care journey and how people find information, before they even make it to the HCP, they've done an extensive amount of research, right? And so we have to rethink, reframe our thinking around who the customer is, right? Your customer is ultimately the patient, right? The patient that is getting the treatment. And they are very powerful, right? And they're very powerful in influencing not only themselves, right, and their adherence to a specific medication or treatment, but influencing the decision that the HCP helps them ultimately make together, right, through shared decision making. And so at Forrester, we define the customer, in this case, as the patient, right? And we look at the HCPs as almost intermediaries, right, that help, they're extensions of your employee base that help advocate for your brand, right, but can also share information and have, be very powerful, right, in the sense of, people trust their HCP, they trust their provider, and so they look to that provider for more information and for guidance. And so it's an extension really of that employee base. When we think about how patients operate right now, more so than ever before, patients do not want to wait if they don't have to. You used Uber as an example at the front of this call, Dario, and it's so true, right? We see this across healthcare, right? People do not want to wait. They want to be able to see their provider, in that moment. If they have to wait, unfortunately, we see huge drop-offs in terms of no-shows for appointments, people turning to competitive solutions for virtual care or more convenient options. Virtual care is something that we've seen just a dramatic surge around over the course of the pandemic, and we don't expect that to go anywhere. And so it's important to keep in mind that, as you reframe your thinking around the patient as my customer, patients take this, self-interested, self-educating approach to their healthcare, to the healthcare for themselves and the healthcare for their family members. Iamini mentioned, the care journey, right? And thinking about, where patients are as they find information. If you think about this phase of, initially you have recognition, right? That I have new symptoms or something is wrong. And then I move very quickly into the research phase. And when you think about the research phase and where people are turning, right, it's Dr. Google, it is to social media, it's to their family members, their friends, and then ultimately they hopefully make it to an HCP. And so when we think about, how do we influence patients and our customer, we have to tap into that research piece, right, of the journey. And so that's where, social media can have a really powerful influence on patients that are turning to their community, especially now more than ever, where their community is online, and that's how they engage. That's how they find information. Yes, and when we think about certain populations, we have to figure out how do we make information more accessible to the entire population. And so when we look at this, we see this untapped opportunity around social media, as well as other platforms, right, and other online resources that pharmaceutical companies can use to be able to educate, but also create brand advocates within their patient base.
Thank you, Ariel. However, how's the data being captured? So this is definitely some very interesting question to ask, because especially in Europe, we have some very strict GDPR law in place, etc. So can you maybe explain a little bit more this part?
Absolutely. So I mentioned, brand advocacy before, right? So brand advocacy is something that you can tap into patients, you can tap into HCPs, right, to be sharing more information about their experiences. So let's talk about some of the different ways that we're seeing pharma use social, and then thinking about how the data that's generated by that platform can then be pushed, right, and used in other ways. So when we think about the different uses of social media, so we see HCPs sharing, more information about new therapies and drugs, right, and helping share information so that it is disintermediated across the population, right, so that more people have that information, but it's also coming from a trusted resource, right? It's one thing for it to come from a branded Twitter handle versus, an Instagram handle. We see people focusing on specific geographies. As Imani was saying, it has to be specific to where you are, right? It has to be contextual. And so if I'm sitting in the US and in North America, right, there are different rules that are in place than if we're sitting in Croatia, right, or sitting in Europe. And so we have to keep in mind that there's different regulations, and therefore each of the ways that you engage with your consumer, right, and the way that information is shared has to be specific and contextual to where those patients or where those potential customers are sitting, right? That's just, it's a unfortunate fact of regulation, right? And then making sure that it also is an experience that resonates with your customer and does not fall flat and say, you know, well, this doesn't apply to my situation, right? And then when we look at, you know, how people are using social media today to influence people, there's a great example just recently, right, of where Botox, right, is using influencers on Instagram, right? And there was this hashtag that went around, I think it was earlier this month, that said, you know, say no to chronic migraine Monday, right? And highlighting the benefits of, you know, using Botox to be able to combat your migraine, right? And so they had Instagram influencers that were sharing their stories and sharing it from, you know, a personal sense of, you know, I understand your journey, right? I understand your experience, and here's how it's affecting me. But then talking about the effects of this drug, right, that can help overcome some of those challenges. And so people see that and they see like individuals, right, sharing their stories, and it starts to create a community and it starts to create an opportunity to engage, right? So you can see the engagement in the comments or in a chat, and it creates a platform for people to share their story. You see this, you know, perhaps most evident when you look at specific, you know, formal communities like patients like me, like 23andMe. And so, you know, these are things that Pharma has been tapping into for quite a while, where I will say that we see opportunities that have been untapped. And perhaps, you know, this goes back to the regulation piece, things like adverse events, right, and adverse drug reactions are being reported on social media, right? And so to some extent, Pharma, you know, has held back from making sure that they engage their customers through social media, in some ways out of fear of these things being reported and shared over social media. Ultimately, what we've seen be found, you know, the FDA has looked at this, there have been different studies that have shown that social media actually captures and uncovers more adverse events and potential adverse drug reactions that would otherwise have gone unnoticed. And so if anything, it's helping improve the efficacy of these drugs, improving the safety of these drugs. And so just because, you know, you're afraid of seeing that information on Facebook or somewhere else doesn't mean it's not happening, right? And so it will ultimately come out later on, which could be a much larger issue for the pharmaceutical industry. I would also say that those are great opportunities to say, how do I tap into this data, right? There's a rich data set that's being created, not only through AEs and ADRs, but also saying, you know, any sort of side effects, right, or benefits that are being captured, you can tap into that data, right, using natural language processing and understanding, machine learning to understand and be able to feed that back to specific personas, to specific drugs that can inform future innovation, right, future therapies, but also ways of being able to engage patients through digital channels and through digital assets. The other piece, you know, I would say that we don't see people tapping into as much, but I expect to see a surge in this area is around recruitment for clinical trials, right? So we have a huge issue right now, maybe more so in the US than some other parts of the world, where we are still sheltering in place across the majority of the US. We will likely have to continue to do so. And so clinical trials right now are difficult, right? It's hard to recruit for a clinical trial and get someone in into the office. And so social media and other platforms provide an outlet to get more information out about an awareness, right, of a clinical trial, but also engaging people in virtual clinical trials, right, and being able to find those individuals that are already online, already engaging, right, and being able to recruit new patients to make sure that those clinical trials can still move forward, even amid some of the chaos and restriction that we have in place today.
Thank you, Ariel. Let's move back to Corey and Reuters report, where we obviously see a mismatch between the current CRM needs. So Corey, can you maybe explain a little bit more? What are those needs today?
Yeah, so you know, I think these are some big numbers here to me that are pretty shocking when we think about things. And if I put this in the context of my previous story of you've got this great product, why aren't people buying it? To me, it resonates with some of the things we're seeing here, right? There's mention about working across channels and consolidating those insights. So when I go back to that situation where my management said, if your product's so great, why is no one buying it? We got into these discussions. Well, sales isn't doing it right, and marketing didn't give me the right material. Oh, product built the wrong thing, and you get this this uh, heated debate going on about what's happening, and when those things happen, you can stop for a moment and stop to look at the data, right? So these reactions that people have when you're challenging that things aren't going right, look to the data and see what's going on. If we start at the bottom here and you don't have the data to do that, then you're going to just be stuck cycling in these arguments and the finger of blame going around the room of it's their fault. And I think when it comes to CRM, in my past life, I was working on EHR software, and one of the things that many people said was no one goes to nursing school or medical school to sit and enter data into a computer all day. And I think that's the same thing in the life sciences industry, right? People are there because they want to have those interactions with other people, right? They're in this altruistic mode of we're going to make a healthier population. So first and foremost, you have to have a CRM that is easy to interact with and that you see the value from entering the data, right? I've had people tell me, I feel like I'm entering data just to validate my existence, to get my paycheck or to get my expenses through. So, we don't want that. If you get the data in, then you can actually consolidate that data and build up the picture of who your customer is. So as Ariel was saying, define who your customer is. It might be the patient, it might be the HCP, it might be a family member, a caregiver. But we can do that. If you think of the old graphic of the 6 blind men touching the elephant, and one says it's a tree, it's a rope, it's a fan, it's a wall. I think that's a good parallel to what we can see in many organizations, because sales is going to have a different experience from marketing, from brand or product, and the medical team. So we've got to get these people working together to drive those insights and surface it. So here again, the numbers are talking about that. We need desperately those tools to bring that data together, put insights out of that tell the picture of who is your customer, what's happening in the environment, not just customer level, but how does that scale up to accounts and networks and segments. And then how do you act on that data, and not just as an individual? How do you bring that data up to a top level so you can set a strategy that then helps you get the whole team pushing in the same direction towards the same goals?
Thank you, Corey. Question to all of you. First of all, in a customer-centric world, how can you be data-driven, right? And how to manage data and convert to insights. Maybe we can start with Christian on that.
Dario, I think it all starts with ambition. Let me share a bit about how we do it as a company and what our aspiration is. So at Sandoz, we're a company with roughly 10 billion sales. We reach hundreds of millions of patients, and we have set ourselves an ambitious goal. So we want to leverage 500 million of value every year from digital. And that refers to digital opportunities, that refers to digital marketing and sales, and using all the digital channels to reach our stakeholders and customers out there. But it also refers to making better use of the data that are out there and being better in what we're doing in terms of internal processes in our pipeline and being cost efficient. If I may share one thing with you, we are in an industry, and that's the off-patent, the generics pharmaceutical industry, that it's ultimately predictable. So we know what our portfolio or the industry's portfolio will be like in 10 or 20 years. And therefore, I'm personally extremely excited about the value of data and automated forecasting, and just digging deep into the data that we have, and therefore I support this really large ambition in terms of numbers and value that we want to generate.
Thank you, Christian. Imani?
I think, how do you go from being a data-driven company like Enforce, kind of incorporating the data, moving to insights? I think finding ways to incentivize or create required or like dependent feedback loops, right? Now I work at a social media company, so it's, part of our overall structure for how we build products is to focus on data and then have those data become insights and then work that back into a feedback loop to actually improve the product, right? So I think depending on what industry you're in, there's different layers of creativity that you're going to have to come up with to make sure you've got those dependent feedback loops and you have that right incentive model to make sure that you are moving from data to insights and back and forth. When I think about it in the context of pharma, you're putting me on the spot here, but let me, if I think about an example with pharma, I think a potential feedback loop could be, oh man, give me 10 seconds, Dario, and if I can't come up with an example, I'll let you go through Corey and Ariel, and then I'm gonna have you come back to me. Is that reasonable?
Of course.
All
Sounds
right.
like a... Corey, same question for you.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, getting into that data-driven mode takes a bit of patience, right, and a little bit of thinking. If you see that you could be doing more with data and being more data-driven, take some time to think about what that really means. For me, one of the things I love is the saying, measure what matters, and there's a great book by John Doerr of the same title that super good read. But think of those things that that you want to measure and that you're going to act on, right? And use that to drive the data that you collect. And be patient with it, because it is going to take some time to gather all of the data you need, but you can collect that data in baby steps. And I think part of this, which I think a large segment of our audience here would be comfortable with, is this idea of taking a research-based approach to it. One of my friends likes to remind people that research means to look again, right? So relook or research. And take that data that you have, look at it, change it, splice and dice it, look at it from different perspectives, see what you can do, see what questions it raises, and from those questions then say, okay, how are we going to measure success on this thing, and use that to go to your next phase of data collection and delivering insights from that.
Thank you, Corey. Ariel, same question for you.
Yeah, and just to maybe build on some of the comments of my fellow panelists ahead of me, tactically, right, the way that we see this being done within the pharmaceutical industry is we see people leveraging, not only the data that they historically have had, but also finding new ways of being able to capture new data sources, right? So pulling in data directly from patients through care management applications, for example, right? So that we can create early interventions when a patient starts to potentially have, maybe it's an adverse side effect or symptoms that they think is related to a new treatment that they're on, but perhaps is completely unrelated, right? There's an opportunity for a care manager or for a physician to intervene and say, hey, Ariel, I noticed that, your heart rate is changing, that you're not moving as much, or, these three things are changing about your vitals. How are you feeling, right? Let's do a quick virtual care visit or a call and talk about what's happening. So because otherwise, if we don't have that support system for a patient, in many cases, it results in them stopping the treatment and stopping the drug. And then we find out, 3 months later, 6 months later. And so being able to intervene early by having that data and turning it into something that's insightful, right? And then, continuing to contribute and build on the data that we're capturing is really important to being able to drive, medication adherence, make sure that we understand, additional, adverse reactions to a drug, for example. So there's benefits, right, that can be uncovered through this process. And I would also say that it hits on a theme of personalization, right? The more that we can make this something that isn't individualized for you, right, and in your specific situation, your disease, etc., the better we can, drive improved outcomes for that individual, which is ultimately the goal, right? We want people to get better or be able to better manage their condition.
Thank you, Ariel. Imani, back to you. Do you have some examples?
Yeah, so I wanted to think of something off the top of my head, right? So I'm trying to be like as innovative as possible on the fly. So you guys can keep me honest as the health professionals, but one of the ideas that I'm kind of thinking about in terms of like how do you create the dependent feedback loop is, and this might already be happening, so maybe it's not original. But to your point, Ariel, of like tracking adverse reactions, like what if there was an option to treat medical solutions or remedies, almost like a package, but then treat that package as if it were a developing series over time. So as an example, let's say you come up with a solution, for the flu virus, right? You come up with a new solution for that. What if as part of that package for tracking the performance of that includes not only kind of recipients, not only the number of success stories, but the number of adverse reactions, and it contains like tagging or tracking that needs to happen. And then there is a monthly, whatever level frequency where that package advances. And every month or level of frequency, you do a check against those metrics just to make sure that they are advancing, and you set a percentage number. I don't know, 5% in terms of overall data collection. But you treat that as a living, breathing package, and there's an evolution check along the way so that it doesn't just stay dormant and become something that was a point in time solution that no one looks at, but there's consistent, enforced kind of tracking and measurement around it. So I don't know if this is something that is palatable or something that's already in place, but starting to treat the solutions like packages and then having regular checkpoints where you are making sure that the data points that compose that package, successes, failures, adverse responses, new nuances that you may have tweaked along the way, and then recording that over time as kind of a living, breathing activity and document. Maybe that's one way to enforce kind of this dependent feedback loop where you have data that you're collecting, you're forcing it to become insights, and then using that as an improvement feedback loop.
Thank you, Imani. Anyone would like to add something about the idea from Imani?
Sure. Yeah, so no, and I completely agree with you. I think that we see some of that in the different patient engagement solutions that are being deployed by various pharma companies, without naming names here, but there's certain companies, right, that have created apps that are specific to a drug or to a condition, right, or typically it's they're focused on chronic conditions, or even thinking about type 2 diabetes, for example, right, and trying to figure out how do we, right, it's much more than just the biochemical reaction right in your body. We need more data than that, and thinking about how various factors influence the ability for you to get better or to even just manage your health and manage your condition. And so we continue to see that iterative process in a lot of the more so in the digital aspects, right? So if it's software as a medical device, or it's thinking about patient application that continues to come out with new enhancements, right, based off of the feedback loop that's been created, right, and we collect that data from the customer so that we can create new support systems, or perhaps it's that creation of a community, as I said, and we typically see those built on CRMs, right, so that we can take all that rich data, bring it together, orient it around a specific patient, and make sure that those touch points are orchestrated based off of the context in which the patient is in. But
Thank you,
completely
Ariel.
agree with you.
We have a theme for our next session, right? Okay, let's talk about the future. Also, a question to all of you. What will pharma communications look like in 5 years' time? Maybe Christian can answer on that because he is obviously coming from pharma. So what's your opinion, Christian, on that?
Dario, thank you very much for making me the first to comment on this. I'm very excited about that. Let me define communications relatively broadly. So, communications for us, starts actually with research and how we communicate with the scientific community, but then it goes all the way to the customer and to the patients. And I really think there's going to be a tremendous change. So it starts with data on research. It will, research will be much more based on real world data. And I think the data overall will be much more reliable. So we'll dig deep in data, and research will be democratized. What I mean with that is everybody has similar access to the data. So we'll see a lot of startups, a lot of academia, and some smaller companies come up with really valuable compounds. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is, of course, I mean, internal communication in pharma companies will change a lot. I mean, you see me taking this webinar from our office. That's, today's first day, Monday to Wednesday, I worked from home. And in our company, we have introduced a program across Novartis, of which Sandoz is a part, that's called Choice with Responsibility. And basically, we have given it to the discretion of all of our employees, all of our office-based employees, to decide without asking for permission what's the best way for them in terms of working, distributed working, where they want to work from, home or office-based, and take this choice with responsibility. And last but not least, in our customer communication, I expect that digital channels will be a new normal, and I think that will lift and improve our ethical standards. What I mean with that is, when we use digital channels, a lot of the communication will be trackable. We will have to stick as an industry to data. We can't talk our way out. So I think the hurdle will be higher for the added value for our medicines. It will hold us more honest, but I think this is great news because it will separate, just made up Me Too's or so from real innovation. And I think this is in the interest of our customers. And it is in the interest of all of us, of the employees in this industry, because real benefit will be rewarded more than before.
Thank you, Christian. Corey?
Yes. So the future of communication, I think, is a lot of what we've talked to really winds up to that, right? We think about what Ariel said was who is your customer now, right? And patients being more empowered and research driven. One of the things that we saw from the survey is that the Med Affairs team is getting more recognition these days, and they're more the people that the customer, the HCPs, want to speak to. Right. So, and I think that flows naturally into this notion of the empowered patient, and patients can go find the information and have a much more educated or thoughtful discussion with their HCPs and the care team. So that level and depth of information is going to be something that's much more important in the future. And I think the other thing, if we go to Imani's example there, of collecting data, those communications can all be data driven, because now a patient's relationship is not just patient to doctor, it's patient to health network, right? Because you've got the clinic that they work at, that they go to see their HCP, but then there might be another clinic they go to for testing, and if they've got something they need to go to the hospital for, especially if it's a chronic condition, they're on a long-term care plan. And technology is playing a role in there. So simple things like wearables, where you can be measuring your heart rate, to more permanent technologies like embedded tracking devices that can tell you what is my blood sugar change over the course of the day, or my exposure to sun, or other things. So all of that data is available to drive better communications, and instead of that monthly or quarterly check-in with someone, you can have that daily thing. And if we go back to that push versus pull kind of thing, the patient ultimately can get this notification that's going to go back to their HCP, which is going to come back to the product provider, right? And so that loop, I think, is going to be a much more connected bunch of discussions, and that will have to be a tighter communication chain to work on the more real-time expectations that people have.
All right. Same question to you, Imani? Or maybe will you still use LinkedIn as a platform? just kidding, right?
We'll all be retired by then. We won't need. Well, but here's the thing. You asked the question, but you didn't necessarily say how far out into the future. Oh, you said 5 years time? Okay. So I think I align very closely with what Corey just mentioned. I think at a high level, hopefully, as a world, we will crack the code on some of the regulation components, right? I do think over time, now that we're in this digital space, people are actually becoming more comfortable voluntarily sharing their information and sharing it in wide, vaster platforms that don't necessarily have the same historical sentiment that they had in the past, which is you go into a doctor's office and you share the information between the four kind of white walls, right? And that is changing. So I think with this outflow of information, we will see a shift in proactive communication from healthcare professionals because they will be able to tap into the availability of data. And my mind is right where Corey's is. With our wearable devices, right? I see a world where in the future, the notification I get on my watch will not be that my move rings are not as closely, closed as they were yesterday, but that my blood pressure seems to be beating at a higher rate than normal, combined with living in wildfire conditions, because my phone shows the geolocation of where I am, could mean something different. So I think it's a much more proactive communication, and it's not reliant on us noticing symptoms and going to our healthcare provider. I think it's more real time and proactive and upfront, leveraging the vast amount of data once we crack the regulation codes.
Thank you, Imani. Ariel?
Yeah, I'll just echo what Iamini mentioned and Corey mentioned and Christian as well, right? To think about, we are going to see a huge shift towards this proactive engagement model with patients, and we'll see that across the healthcare industry, whether it's in pharma, it's your provider, it's your health plan. We've already seen a huge shift towards things like self-triage tools, right, that help, do some self-diagnosis, but also tell you where you should be going for care and make that actionable. And if we see integration with the health plan, right, we start to see how much it's going to cost. And then we start to see, perhaps some treatment options and how much those are going to cost us within our health insurance. And so I think we'll start to see with this proliferation of data, right, that we're going to see more actionable insights, right, to your point, I am going to say, at that point of I recognize that there's something wrong. I not only know, what to do or what might be wrong, but what do I do next, right? And how much it's going to cost me, right? And I'm much more empowered as a consumer to make those informed decisions. And we'll continue to see that through the proliferation of remote patient monitoring, right? The continuous monitoring of data for individuals and making sure that's integrated to, artificial intelligence enabled tools like a self-triage device that can help you make sense of what that data means.
Thank you, Ariel. So we are left with only 2 minutes, so in pretty good time. I would like to pick one audience question, which is, how do we ensure information available in social media is accurate? Maybe Imani might give the best answer on that, if I may say so.
So it is tough, right? It's tough. It is not easy to make sure that information is accurate. Here's the reality though. This is nothing new, right? It's just in a digital form. Before this, you had print media, you had regular television media, and you still had to strike that balance between what is accurate, what is truthful, and what is not, right? So I want to make sure people know it's not a new problem, right? Maybe it's exacerbated because you have more people with the forum to share that, right? So I'd say employ some of the traditional methods that we've learned historically over time from other media, which is double check, right? Try and corroborate your information and your data sources. For some information that might not be as prevalent and might not have enough data sources to check against, you're starting to see the advent of like fact checkers, which are people who are I don't want to say certified, but people who spend their entire time making sure they can do that due diligence and that comparison for you. I think that's very important in the medical space. So I do think we'll start to see kind of the fact checker components probably expand over time in terms of people validating information. But I think even with certification from a third party or a different person, it's still going to be incumbent upon each of us as individuals to make sure that we study and we research and we compare as many data sources as possible to make sure that we're dealing with truth. But I do think, again, this is not a new problem. I think it's just exacerbated because a lot of people have a forum to speak more broadly.
Thank you, Imani. Ariel, Christian, Corey?
Yeah, just to add to that, so I would say that, we see the use of analytics, right, and various algorithms to be able to basically be those fact checkers, right, in some cases to say, how do we train this fact checker, right, this algorithm to say, is this data accurate? Is this perhaps, someone that is making claims that, that it doesn't make, total sense right, in terms of the adverse reaction that they're reporting, for example, right? And there are algorithms that are being built, right, to be able to analyze all of this data. You have to be able to take all of that raw data that is in a bunch of different places, right? All these discrete data resources, aggregate it together in a way that makes sense, and then analyze it, right? To turn it into something that's insightful from an organizational or enterprise perspective.
I think Ariel said it very well. I think there's a certain level of skepticism that you need to apply to the things that occur. So a good level of quality check is definitely mandatory, and therefore I believe we are currently focusing more on the outgoing communication on social media, more trying to reach the communities out there, rather than in a very structured way. So looking at all the noise and what's incoming. I think that's the current reality.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, because social media can be very, very noisy. But these could be indications. This noise, maybe there's a little spike there, is a place that, okay, let's go investigate that and dig into it. And so that's where you can lean back on the rest of the data. You may have the AI that can help you make some sense of it, and some of it is going to be human judgment as well there.
Great. So then, thank you very much, Ariel, Imani, Christian, and Corey, for taking part in this extremely interesting session. We will publish this during next week also on our official YouTube channel, so make sure you subscribe on it. Once again, thank you very much, and hopefully we see us in some of our upcoming initiatives, right? So thank you once again, and all the best.
Thanks,
Thanks, Ariel.
Dario.
Thanks, everybody.
Stay well.
Bye.
Stay well. Take care.